Alright guys, so welcome back. Today we're going to be talking a little bit more about Collagraph and specifically going into textures. So in the last video, I made this Collagraph plate, and it's a very simple idea. It's just layers of cut paper, and those edges of height difference is what catches the ink. And so this ends up printing in a really straightforward way, in a really predictable way. But I always get questions about textures, and Collagraph is a great way to incorporate textures into your work, as well as to work big, because you don't have to spend a lot of money on copper, right, if you wanted to do giant, like, intaglio style plates. So I have here with me today some supplies. So I'm going to start playing with some texture. Now, I have a sheet of Bristol paper. I have a sheet of, I actually have a harder surface. So on this plate, I used 2 layers of Bristol paper to create a, honestly, somewhat flexible plate. And this held up really well, but depending on the image that you're using a base of Bristol might not be sturdy enough. So what I've got today is a piece of Davy board, mat board, whatever you want to call it. I cut this off the back of my Bristol pad. So this is like the underside of the Bristol pad. And it's probably not acid free, but I don't really need to worry about that for this today. I also have with me some things that I think might give me some texture. So I have this piece of fabric. This is actually a piece of silkscreen silk, and you can see that it's kind of been through the wringer. It's not smooth, it's not flat, but you can glue bits of fabric down to your plate, and if you intaglio wipe it, the texture of the fabric will hold ink. So even though this is not flat, I'm sure I'll get something out of it. I have with me some glue today. So this is just your PVA glue. You could also use like white school glue, especially if you're using glue to create textured effects and lines. In addition to that, I have, this is really important. So this is a gel medium, and they come in a lot of different textures and finishes. This is a gloss medium, so this is going to be a sort of smoothing effect, and I may use it kind of sparingly, or I might use it a lot. The key here is that you really want to use something to seal everything in, because I'm making everything out of paper. I really could damage the plate by trying to clean it, or like the process of wiping ink into those textures. So this should seal the plate well enough for me to pull multiple impressions without damaging my plate. And I did use, I actually didn't have gel medium when I made this plate in that last video. I just used nail polish to seal this one in. And if you don't have gel medium, nail polish, like clear nail polish, works just fine. So I know some people have that more likely than this, but this is what we're gonna be using. This is what I gave my students. Speaking of nail polish, I have pulled out today this glitter, and I think it might have a good like texture. So I've got this Holiday Sparkle. We're gonna try that out. We'll experiment. I've got some masking. Actually, this is drafting tape, but masking tape would work just the same. And this is something that I could cut and layer to create little shapes and patterns on the surface of the plate. So I'll try that today. And then I also have some little dried plant matter. So plant matter is a little bit tricky to work with, and I know students love working with real. But as soon as you're like, oh, you could put real flowers in it, they're like, yes, let's do it. But just a caveat on including plant matter in your Collagraph plate, you do want to dry it and press it. If you try and run anything that's a little bit wet through the press, it'll squish out all of the water in a terrible way. And you just need to make sure that they don't have a lot of moisture in them. So these little, these are actually carrot tops that I cut off my carrots and then pressed. So these little carrot tops are pretty dry, and I think they'll be, this one's still a little bit flexible. This one's a little bit more dry, so maybe I'll use this one first. And so I'm going to incorporate that into this design. One of the thoughts I have about Collagraph is that it's an incredibly flexible medium, right? You can do anything to it. You can glue, there's a lot of things you could glue to a piece of cardboard and that would have a texture. And so my sort of artistic sense here is that you want to figure out a vocabulary of textures and then limit that vocabulary. Don't just because you can glue anything to the surface of your plate doesn't mean you should, right? And so I think in order to create an image that has some harmony, you actually want to kind of narrow down the marks that you want. In addition to these things I'm going to glue down, I'm also going to scratch some textures manually into the surface once that I've got things a little bit sealed into place. So enough of that exposition, let's just go on into it. So over here I have a tiny little sketch. This is my little thumbnail of the plan. So I'm just gonna do a little like still life on a table, just some simple shapes, really keep it simple, but I'll try and do some different textures for different parts of it. So instead of flowers coming out, I'll have my carrot tops, and I'll get like a basic shape for this little vase, a different texture, and then maybe a third texture for this background. Okay, so I think that what I'm gonna try and do, well, we'll start out with this fabric layer. And I'm gonna go ahead and glue this one down, and we'll see how it goes. Keep in mind that everything that you glue down will be mirrored. So if you want it to, the angle to go this way, you need to glue it down like this, just FYI. So I'm gonna go ahead and scrape some glue over the surface of this plate. And this is just PVA glue. And we're gonna just do this. I can't promise you this is going to be the best Collagraph anyone's ever seen, but I think we'll get some textures and we'll get a sense of what we can do with it, and that's the goal here today. So let's just glue this down. I have a piece of scrap paper here so I don't get glue all over my table. Yay! Don't glue your tables. Okay. That'll do. That'll do for now. I'm actually going to scrape glue into it from the top side too. I want to glue it and kind of flatten it out a little bit. I have a whole video dedicated to silk aqua tint, which is what this is. It's a Collagraph technique, and so the texture of this silk will kind of hold ink in a way that kind of emulates an aqua tint look. So my plan for this table here is it will be a sort of dark tinted space. Now there are little threads that are breaking free. Those little threads will probably ink. We'll see how they do. I'm not going to worry too much about it. And I might need a little bit more glue here. Let's make sure this is firmly glued into place here. And I'm just using this little piece of mat board to just sort of squeegee it down and press it into place. I'm just sort of squishing that through the mesh of the fabric here. So I'm using screen print mesh, but you could use anything that was like a fabric that had like you could use silk for this. You need something that has like a woven texture. I wouldn't try and do this with a knit. I don't think that would be a very beautiful mark, but hey, I haven't tried it with knit. So if you have done this with a knit fabric or any other, like other fabrics, I'd love to see some pictures of your results, so please feel free to share them with me, and I would love to see it. Alright, so now I've got this kind of glued down, and I'm going to go ahead and trim these edges a little bit. Maybe I should let it dry for a second. I'll let it dry, and then I'll trim the edges. So meanwhile, while this is drying, I'm just going to set it over here, out of the way. While this is drying, I'm going to go ahead and cut myself a shape for the glass bottle. So the glass bottle is transparent. It's a dark color, but I think what I'll do is I'll end up cutting it out of a heavier weight piece of Bristol, and that should actually cut. I'll glue that on top of this, so I'll have a nice crisp shape here. So before I do that, I should probably, let me grab a pencil. Okay, so here I've cut myself a little kind of smile piece out of Bristol, and I want to kind of cover up a little bit of the stems as they enter the bottle. So what I'm going to do right here is actually going to take my knife, and I'm gonna go ahead and slice those stems right at that point, because I could layer this on top of the stems, but I don't think it would be as good as if there are no stems underneath it, right? I don't want it to be too much of a height difference here because of those layering those stems. So I'm just using it as a sort of template, and now I'm gonna peel off these stems underneath where that goes, right? So now when I put this little sort of smile piece in, it'll go right here, and it will just be a sort of line in the glass. So at this point, things are starting to dry, and I've got myself a couple different textures. I have my plants, I have this surface, I have this silk surface, I've got some smooth surfaces, and we're going to kind of work in from there. What I'm going to try is I'm actually going to see if I can construct a little window kind of viewed from the side here. So I'm going to use a piece of tape here, and this is just, you know, masking tape, and I'm just going to kind of tape that down, kind of seal it in. Oh. Just fold it around. Now, this is where you might use your scissors to cut yourself some beautiful edges, you know, if you're using masking tape for this purpose. And think about what might look good. Now, I'm using this artist tape, and I don't think it's a very good pick. It's not sticky enough, and so I've been having a little bit of issues with it, but we'll see how it does. So this will just be my window. Oh, slight angle here. Just gonna get that glued down, taped down too. It's a bit of a liability. The idea here is that this little slight change in texture will grip some of the ink. It'll be subtle, but it might well be there, you know. And so what I might end up doing here is, if I want to lighten this area so that this part here has less texture, I can layer up some of these gel mediums to sort of smooth it out. So what's a little bit confusing here, I think, is the colors in this block, because it's not the colors that are going to print, it's really the textures, right? So let's play around with this a little bit more here. So if I wanted to have some texture in this table, right, one of the things that I can do that's pretty straightforward is actually I can use layers of my gel medium to smooth out some of that texture. So let me pour a little bit of gel medium into a cup, and we're going to play around with this. Bring this in. So what I want to kind of capture here is maybe a little bit of like wood grain, right? Like we're looking at a table here. Now I maybe made a mistake here by including this leaf part too early. Now I do want to seal the whole thing, but with this silk aquatint texture, basically it's going to take multiple layers to cover up that texture. So the first layer kind of seals it in place, and then the second layer kind of goes in and reduces a little bit of that texture. Now, some artists that I know, including myself, might choose to add a little bit of white to this gel medium, a little bit of white acrylic paint, because as I'm putting up layers, I'm getting less texture, and so adding a little bit of white kind of helps you visualize that a little better. So I'm going to seal down what I have right now. I'm letting it be kind of brushstrokey. I'm hoping that some of those brush strokes will translate. Alright, so now I've got a first layer of gel medium down on this, and I just want to highlight here that it's not the colors that you see here, it's really the textures. The textures that you have on the plate are going to be what holds the ink. So this is a question of developing those different textures. So what I want here is I want my light source to be coming in from this window. So I'm going to go ahead and glue down this little white piece of paper here, and that will brighten up this area. And make it a little bit smoother. I'm going to let it overhang a little bit off the side here so that I can cut it flush. Another thing to think about that's really important with this process is layering and which layer goes down first. So if I wanted to have a wallpaper texture behind these plant, I would have needed to have glued that down earlier, right? So just sort of keep that in mind. You can't just kind of you have to sort of layer up the things that are behind in your composition. You have to actually layer them up first. So let's see how this does. So, something there glued down. It's not a totally smooth surface. It's okay. The other thing I forgot to mention is that because this is going to be rubbed with ink, you need to kind of treat it like a fragile surface. And that means when you clean it, you can't just like stick it into water. It is still made out of paper. But one thing that can help is by sealing all the way around the plate. So once I've got a little bit more going on the front, I'm actually going to go ahead and seal the back of my plate too. That'll help with a little bit of the warping that we're starting to see where it's starting to bend with the moisture, but it will also just make the plate a little bit more durable as we get around to printing it. So next up, I'd like to go in a little bit with my handy dandy glitter here. So in traditional collagraphs, something that you'll see as a sort of common technique is gluing down something called carborundum grit. So carborundum grit is basically just kind of finely milled metal bits that you can use to polish, say, your lithostone. But some artists will actually mix that, like layer that carborundum grit down onto their plate, and that gives it a kind of aquatint texture. So this is kind of my substitute. I don't actually have carborundum grit with me, so I'm just using this like glitter green. But I imagine there's other gritty things that you could use. You could mix with it. You could cut sandpaper shapes. Just don't use your nice scissors for that, please. But you could cut sandpaper shapes. You could, and they would have their own texture. But I like this because I think it's going to seal in pretty well. So I'm going to layer in with this gritty texture thing. And so one thing I really want to have a deeper shadow. So this is going to be, because it's going to be textured, it's going to be like a deep shadow. So thinking about where my dark shadows are on this shape. So I've got some shadows on the bottle right? And I can kind of lay some of these textures down. So I'm gonna kind of paint, I'm just gonna paint this on a little bit. But I could easily make a sort of textured paint out of some kind of grit of some kind and a little bit of glue or a little bit of gel medium and layer that down and have some pretty exciting results here. So I'm going to kind of go around the lip of the bottle here and give it a little bit of texture, hopefully making it feel a little bit more three-dimensional. Come around the side here. There's a little bit of water in this bottle that the plants are in. And I want to indicate that with a little bit of texture. Alright, so before I go any further, I've let this dry a little bit, and I don't want this to get too complicated. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start this next part out by sealing in what I've got so far. So let me go ahead and I'm going to seal the back of this plate just the same way I sealed the front. Now, depending on how thickly you apply your gel medium or matte medium, you may actually need to do several coats to fully seal. What happens is if your plate isn't sealed enough and you go in to print it, what you're going to find is that the plate will kind of drink up the ink. The sealing process doesn't just help protect your print when you go to clean your print, it also changes how it prints. And I found that that if the plate hasn't been sealed well enough, that when you go in to layer that ink onto it, it basically just absorbs into the plate. And what that can do is it can just take a lot more ink than you might expect and not print as rich as you would want. So this process here is actually just, don't skip out on sealing your plate. Even if you're like, oh, I'll just print once and I don't really need to seal it, like, go ahead and seal it anyway, because it really does actually change how it prints. And the gel medium adds its own texture. So as you're putting this on here, this is the back of the plate, so of course it doesn't matter, but this will just kind of protect the back of my plate a little bit. And I also would like to seal these edges here. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of wrap the sides here. I've coated the back now, and what I want to do is I want to kind of add a little bit more to the front here. So I've got these little strips of paper. I'm going to glue them down and create a sort of stripy pattern here on this table, give it a little bit of interest. So let me go ahead and do that there. All right, so I've got these little pieces now that are glued down, and I think that'll give me just a little bit of movement. I wanted to glue another one right here, but because I have those leaves glued down, I can't really layer it underneath, and it would just be kind of tricky. So I'm just going to let the stripes end right here. It might not be the most beautiful choice, but I'm going to live with that. Another thing that I decided to do is that, you see I glued a little piece down here onto the pot. It'll be a little shine spot. But one of the things I was concerned about is the thickness of these little stems. And so here inside the bottle, I want them to be a little bit subtler. I don't want them to be quite so prominent. I don't want them to look like they're outside the bottle. And I'm going to somehow make it feel a little bit more like they're inside the bottle. So what I'm doing right now is I'm actually shaving them down a little bit. They're glued down and they're going to be there, but I don't want them to be quite as thick, right? I want them to sort of be a little bit more subtle. And don't carve towards your fingers. Move your fingers out of the way. I want them to be a little bit more subtle. So I'm going in here as I'm just kind of shaving them down so that there's still that little bit of bump of them, but they kind of like blend in a little bit more with the texture of the bottle, right? And I can kind of like have them be a little bit more subtle in here. So let that be pretty good. The other thing that I can do is I can also say shave down a little bit of this edge. So right now this and this are the same height and made out of the same material. So I actually maybe want there to be a little bit of a lip around the edge of this bottle, creating a sort of dark line. So in order to keep that dark line right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that same idea and I'm going to shave down a little bit of the paper right here. You know, be careful with this. This is just, you know, if you don't want to do it this way, you could always just use a thinner paper for this kind of part of your process, right? There's no reason why you have to use just bristle. But here I see I can just shave down some of those layers of bristle and just get myself a little bit more of an edge here as it comes up to the bottle. I don't know. I think that might look nice. Because we don't really know what this is going to be printing like. A lot of this is kind of guesswork, especially when you're first learning how to make collagraphs, right? You know, you're like, but when you have a sort of edge, right, the ink, when we wipe this intaglio, ink will kind of hug that edge a little bit. And the texture should be fairly consistent since we're going to seal everything with the gel medium. So let me do one more right here. Let's get that. Okay. So now that I've got those down, what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to do a little bit of painting with the glue. So one of the things that the glue can do is you can actually draw lines with something like white glue and just let it dry and it will print as a sort of dimensional white surface. So let's go ahead and create a kind of little line drawing on the surface of this tablecloth. I'm not worried too much about it. You know, maybe I should be, but for me this is not a particularly fussy process, you know. I'm just kind of having a good time and just gonna lay this down here. Oops. Okay, that's a little bit too much. So I'm gonna probably let that dry for a little while. finish right there. Let's fix that little line. Yeah, and then maybe I'll have like, this is an edge, right? So we'll just have like little fringe coming off this side here. All right, gonna let that dry. Over here I have, now there's a couple things real here I would like to mention is that if I want there to be a dark texture of the water going on top of the stems, probably gonna want to go over another layer of the glitter and just darken that in a little bit. And I may also want to layer, since the shadow from the bottle is going to be a shadow on top of these Bristol pieces as well as below it, I'm going to actually layer another layer of that glitter texture on top of this area here to give me a little bit more of that beef texture. And I think I'm going to add a little bit more interest back here. Maybe a little landscape or something, just a little bit of like energy and movement in this little quadrant since it's just kind of dead. So let me just put down some marks here. We'll call it a landscape. Let's. Excellent. So let me do a little bit more work on this area here. So now I'm going to just layer where I want those shadows to kind of be on top of the stems. I also want there to be, careful here, layer a little bit more of that texture on top of these raised elements and a little bit here down below. So here on this little part, I want to kind of maneuver it So that should actually integrate these elements a little bit more than they were before. The last step here would be to do another layer of gel medium. Let that dry and see where it's at. Kind of trying to test the plate by feel rather than by look, right? Because I have how it looks isn't necessarily how it's going to print. So don't be fooled by the way the colors of the plate look here. It's going to be the application of the ink that's going to really set that in motion. So I'm going to let this dry and we'll come back to it in a little bit. Now you can see this is dried a little bit more. This glue becomes clear when it's dry, so it's a little bit hard to see what it's doing, but you can run your finger across the surface of the plate to kind of feel what your results might be. I'm going to do one more coat of the gel medium, specifically because these little bits of paper haven't been glued in, and just kind of do a kind of thin layer. I don't want to obliterate the texture of this fabric, so I can actually water down a little bit. Just do like a really thin layer, and that should be enough to seal these areas. And then I will be ready to print. We'll see what we've got. The last thing you might consider doing as something to add texture to your piece is to actually go in and make some scores in the surface of the materials. You can use an etching needle or a little X-Acto knife. I have an Alpha knife here. And you can actually score a pattern into the background area. So depending on the material you have, one might leave a better mark than the other. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to score a texture on the wall behind this bottle, and we'll sort of see how this will print. Maybe this will just give me a little bit of depth for my window pane, right? Nothing too crazy. So I'm just kind of slicing the wood a little bit. All right, so I'm gonna just let this dry. It'll probably need to dry overnight, maybe even a little bit longer than that, depending on how thick your layers are. But then we can print this, roll this up with ink and see how it prints. Yeah, that's a Collagraph.